right, folks, welcome back. All right, we're going to transition into our last panel of the night, the headline panel, the journalist panel, uncensored panel, moderated by Maria Virginia Olano of Canary Media.
Hello, hello. It's so wonderful to be with all of you today. Thank you so much for making it out here and celebrating our second birthday with us. My name is Maria Virginia Olano, and I am with the editorial team at Canary Media. Thank you so much for reading us, for supporting us, for sharing our work. It's been a wonderful 2 years, and for many more to come. I am thrilled to be here with three esteemed local journalists who I'm sure need no introduction, but I am gonna give one anyway. We have Sabrina Shankman, she's with the Boston Globe. There we go. We have Miriam with WBUR. And we have Sam Mintz with RTO Insider. Okay, so we are meeting after what was the warmest January in all 6 New England states, and the 6th warmest January ever recorded in the country. We're also meeting a few weeks after another IPCC panel that once again put an alarming call for quick deployment of renewables and ramp down of fossil fuels. That report once again stoked in the region ideas to accelerate the transition to clean energy. It's a region that already has pretty ambitious climate goals comparatively, and so we are here to talk about that. How are we doing on the road to net zero by 2050 in Massachusetts? So yeah, let's start with that. Massachusetts has a new administration and some pretty lofty goals. How is this administration handling climate? We can start with you, Sabrina.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, so the Baker administration, the most recent administration prior to this one, can count to its credit that there was some incredibly ambitious legislation that passed during that tenure. What the administration of Maura Healey has to do is actually turn that into action in a lot of ways. And, you know, it's been interesting. Obviously, she's just come in, you know, but the thing that she did on her first day was create a new climate chief position that's a cabinet level position that, you know, the Healey administration says is the only one of its kind in the country. And in speaking with her for a story that I did with Melissa Hoffer, the new climate chief, one of the things that I found really interesting was that she had actual things to do. Like it wasn't just a title that kind of had some vague authority, TBD, let's see how things go. It was like, okay, no, it's, you know, it's her job to be making sure that the state is applying for all the federal funds that are available to get as much from Massachusetts as possible from the landmark legislation that's passed. It's her job to be coordinating with all the different agencies to make sure that they all know what they're required to do under the existing legislation so they can actually reach those goals and then have some accountability. So, I mean, that's one example, but I think there's, you know, it remains to be seen, you know, how much is going to actually get accomplished. They are very ambitious goals. I think there are going to be more goals that continue to get rolled out by the Healey administration in the coming months to even step up what Massachusetts is aiming to do. But so far, it seems like they've hit the ground running at least.
Anything to add?
Sure. I would say that I think one thing that maybe separates this administration so far from the previous one is the intense focus on environmental justice. And not that the Baker administration didn't talk about that and try to center those things, but I think that you can really tell from everyone that's been appointed and the just different things that have happened so far that this is front and center and that we are not just going to transition for some people in the state and not for others. So that, I think, also to their credit is great.
Yeah, and to me, the thing that stood out is watching the sort of personnel choices. You know, there's this slightly cliched saying that personnel is policy, which I do believe is true to a certain extent. So I've been interested in seeing what sort of new positions they've created. For example, a couple of new folks in an office focused specifically on regional energy and climate policy. I've hired a few people from the sort of NEPOL, ISO New England orbit. And then also, of course, we'll talk about the DPU later, I think, but I was really interested in seeing those hires and seeing sort of what those signal. Because, we're all waiting for policy stuff to happen, and for the most part, it hasn't happened yet because it's too early. So the personnel has been interesting for me to watch.
Awesome. So let's get into some of those goals. A lot of this is riding on the build out of clean energy, specifically offshore wind. Massachusetts will need 50 gigawatts of clean energy resources by 2050. A majority of that is going to be made up of offshore wind. It also has a storage target of 1,000 megawatt hours by 2025, which is just around the corner. So maybe starting off with offshore wind, Miriam, I know you've done a ton of reporting and you've been down at Barnstable. Can you tell us what is going on with the projects and are they on track?
Yeah, the offshore wind situation right now is very interesting, and Sam, feel free to chime in too, because I think you cover a lot more, Sabrina as well. You can kind of say that there's like a tale of two industries happening right now. There's Vineyard Wind, which is that first 800 megawatt project, and that is on schedule. And right now they are laying transmission cables. I was down in Barnstable and saw, and it's really cool, these like giant cables coming under the ocean, and just the machinery it takes to lay them will blow your mind. But so Vineyard Wind is on track to start producing power by the end of this year. It should be fully up and running next year, and that's 800 megawatts, which is sizable. But some of the other projects that are coming down after are facing some very serious financial problems. Most notably, Avangrid's Commonwealth Wind project, which you haven't been following, is a great sort of nerdy, insidery story, but they signed some contracts with utilities, and then inflation is inflation, and they're saying it's no longer financially viable. So they tried to renegotiate and sort of ended up pulling out of their contracts. They want to rebid in the spring. So I mean, I think to me what's interesting is that it's not the technology that is holding up the industry right now. It's the finances, and that feels like that requires a different set of remedies.
Yeah, I would add too, I mean, it's not just Avangrid, it's also the South Coast Wind
Yep.
project too, which, they're...
And in other states.
Yeah, I mean, it's all over the place. But what's interesting is, like, you've got that slowing things down on the one side. And then at the same time, Massachusetts has historically been such a leader on offshore wind. But other states have caught up, right? Like New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, all over the eastern seaboard, there's this big buildup of offshore wind that's happening. And then you also have it happening globally, right? So we're slowing down, and so are other places in the US too, but the US also doesn't have a supply chain in-house, really. There is not the kind of manufacturing in the US that there is in Europe. So at the same time that the US is going to be coming out of this financial, conundrum and hopefully figuring some things out, it's also going to be finding itself, I think, in a really interesting competitive place where all of a sudden there is this need for resources that, are actually in Europe and are being claimed by European countries that are developing their offshore wind. And I think it's going to be a really interesting dynamic to watch over the next, 5-10 years.
Yeah, I would add too, there's another procurement coming up, another auction coming up this spring, and I think that will be, one, interesting to see who participates and what prices they're even able to offer, but this will be the first time that there's a procurement without something called the price cap. Prior to last summer, there was this policy in Massachusetts, or this rule in Massachusetts, that every subsequent wind project needed to produce cheaper and cheaper electricity. And you can understand why that happened at the beginning, because this was an industry that no one was really sure actually could work, but it's outlived its usefulness and was eliminated. Other states don't have it. So it'll be interesting to see what these companies offer in terms of economic development, in terms of manufacturing, and who bids at all, right? I mean, the economy is still not great.
Yeah, I think the thing that stands out to me is that obviously this is not, at this point, brand new technology, and it's not, a brand new process of developing these projects, but that's still, it's unpredictable in that new things are coming up all the time, and it's hard to be, the first company doing it in a new place, especially. And I was thinking back to, I think it was last year, for the people who've really followed this, you'll probably know about the federal auction, a federal lease for a parcel of ocean off New York. I think it's called the BIGHT, B-I-G-H-T. and these just like astronomical numbers that these companies were bidding in order to win access to these locations. And then you contrast that with these problems that the companies here are running into, where they're saying inflation is rampant and we can't pay for these projects. It happens so quickly, and it seems like a really, if I was a developer for one of these companies, I'd be really stressed all the time.
And of course, we can't talk about offshore wind without talking about transmission. And in the panel before, we heard about interconnection woes, and that is certainly true in the region as well. So I'm curious, how have you seen regional cooperation, or maybe lack thereof, on the transmission issue? Sam?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing to say to start, and I wrote down some numbers because there was this really good, Berkeley National Laboratory had a study that came out just today, actually, with some really great stats about interconnection, which for anyone who doesn't know is sort of the process by which grid operators and utilities sort of evaluate new projects and whether there's transmission upgrades that are needed to attach them to the grid. So first of all, it's taking a lot longer than it used to for the interconnection process to happen. It used to be 2 years back in 2008, 3 years in 2015, and for projects that came online in 2022, it took an average of 5 years from when they entered the interconnection queue to when they came on board. And these are almost all clean energy. In New England in particular, I think there are literally no fossil projects left in the interconnection queue. So it's a huge bottleneck, and something that, frankly, I haven't seen any grand, smart answers to. There's a lot of little regulatory tweaks going on, a lot of efforts, like you mentioned, regionally and federally to unlock more transmission access, but it's a really thorny problem that is not going away and is probably just going to get worse and harder.
Okay, anything to add?
Yeah, well, I mean, you can't talk about transmission right now without talking about what is happening on Monday in my home state of Maine, where there is kind of like the last hurrah of, is Maine actually going to allow the completion of a major transmission line through western Maine, bringing hydroelectric energy from Quebec to the New England grid. Now, this is a project, for people who aren't familiar with it, that has been in the works since around 2017, although the project developer told me he felt like it was more like 2012 when they really started trying to get it up and running. But the idea is, Massachusetts utilities have contracted 1,200 megawatts of hydroelectric energy from Hydro-Quebec. It is a cornerstone of how Massachusetts plans to reach its climate goals. And everything was going apace in terms of the permits and everything until a referendum in 2021 in which voters said they did not want it to go forward. It was this fascinating case where you had the state's largest conservation group, the Natural Resources Council of Maine, partnered up in essence with fossil fuel companies, many like big oil companies from Texas that did not want this project to go forward, and so they funded this incredibly expensive campaign to shut it down, and it worked. Now there is this question of, was it constitutional? Did the companies actually have the right to build this transmission line when they sunk like $430 million in the project? And so that's going to start getting get hashed out in a jury trial, of all things, starting Monday in Maine. So you're going to have a jury, which is like a very strange thing, right? You've got a jury of 9 individuals who will be deciding the fate of one of the most consequential energy projects in the region. So that is like, for me, one of the most interesting things going on right now, and so crucial, because that issue of how do you get electricity from northern New England to southern New England is this really crucial question that has to get answered, because you're not going to be building out utility scale solar and onshore wind in Massachusetts and where you've got all these people. It's going to be up there, and the energy has to find a way down here.
One thing I would add to, and a topic that I got strangely obsessed with at the end of last year, is offshore transmission is also a really interesting prospect, that you can avoid a lot of the troubles that you have when you're building on land by moving things into the ocean. And in particular for offshore wind, there are a lot of benefits in terms of reliability and maybe even cost by literally connecting wind farms off the coast and bringing power directly where they need to go. So you could get lines going straight into Boston as opposed to going to the Cape and then somehow needing to get upshore. And so the New England states have a process where they're really looking into this right now to see what is feasible, what's not, what federal dollars can they tap. And the Biden administration is really into this. They are, I believe, about a year and a half into a 2-year study where they're really analyzing the feasibility of some sort of networked offshore transmission system for the Atlantic coast. So I think it's exciting.
And this is not some crazy new technology, right, Miriam? This already exists, like it's viable?
Yeah, sure. I mean, people have been, some European countries have offshore transmission. I mean, they're transmission lines, right? That's like how islands get their power in a lot of ways. But yeah, some of you might be familiar with the Google backbone idea that came about a long time ago. That was back when offshore wind in Massachusetts had its first big promise that fizzled, but this talk of connecting everything offshore, and it would enable Massachusetts to buy wind from a project in the New York Bight. It would just open things up in a lot of really interesting ways. It also has a lot of ecological benefits too. You're just using literally less line. You're digging up less of the ocean to get more power exactly where you need it. So it's expensive and it involves a lot of coordination, which is probably going to be its downfall if there is a downfall. But yeah, a lot of upfront work.
So before we move on here, I do want to go back to Sabrina, your point, because I think that speaks to a larger issue about local opposition to clean energy projects. And shout out to the Carbon Copy that did a fantastic episode this week about this phenomenon that's happening all over the country. But I'm really curious, where else do you see that playing out here in New England?
Where do we not see it playing out? I mean, I think we see it in every major project that comes up. There is some form of that. For instance, there's a lawsuit against Vineyard Wind, which is not going to really stop anything.
There are 4.
Yeah, and I mean, there's this new kind of, especially among conservatives, this new messaging of the whales versus wind, and this opposition. And do we really care about the whales, or do we just not want clean energy? That's not mine to litigate in this moment, but there's that. There's I mean, I hear in my inbox, you guys probably do too, all the time from people who are like, I am a conservationist and I care deeply about climate change, but they are trying to build a solar field in my community.
Yeah, this is not the right place for this here, And
right. What about the cranberry bogs? What about the forests that I care about? There are you can go all around Massachusetts and find a thing that people want to protect, and that is completely legitimate. We are facing a biological diversity crisis in addition to a climate crisis, and there are smart ways to figure this out. You have to protect corridors for wildlife, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. However, you also have to build a ton of clean energy for us to not cook the planet. And so the NIMBYism is, rampant.
I would just add, this is a huge source of frustration for the people who are working on building these clean energy projects. They talk about it all the time. It's what comes up. They talk about the siting. They talk about how there's this sort of momentum and wind to their backs from the federal government, from the state and regional governments, saying, here's all this money, go build us the stuff we need to decarbonize. And then they get to these local siting boards and people say, is that solar panel going to explode? Or, this is blocking my view of the X. And it can be really challenging to deal with. They need those approvals, they need those permissions, they need to win those people over. And the lobbying doesn't work the same way that it does if you're lobbying, Congress or even a state house. It's different, it's very personal, it takes a lot of time. And so it's definitely a challenge to watch.
For sure, and all of this is going to start playing out in a very local level. This is going to start playing out in committee meetings and very local town halls. So that's going to be fascinating to follow. Something else that comes up a lot, both on proponents and maybe some of the opponents to clean energy, is jobs. Touting jobs, job creation is huge on the pro side, but when we think about something like offshore wind, you mentioned that before, we have no supply chain here. So a lot of the jobs that are going to be created, at least in the short term, are going to be in construction, not necessarily the lasting long-term job creation. So what are you seeing there, and where are we seeing some opposition, for instance, for local fisheries that are hugely important in the region as well?
I think, if I can take that first, I think I'm going to separate that into 2 questions. On the jobs front, I think that everyone agrees that renewable energy has a tremendous power to spur a ton of jobs. And I think if we're not seeing it right now, we will start seeing it very soon, is that there are not enough people. I mean, if you've ever tried to like call an electrician so you can install a heat pump or do something, like there are not enough people doing this. And I know that this is a priority of the Healy administration. I think it was a priority of the Baker administration as well. And so it will be very interesting to see how that plays out. I think a lot of people in power, both federally and at the state, have a very strong commitment to these being good jobs. They want these to be union jobs. They want these to be well-paying jobs. And so whether or not that can happen will be something very interesting to watch. And I can answer the fisheries question, or if someone else wants to take that or add on to the jobs thing.
Yeah, I mean, well, I would just agree with the jobs thing in that we're already seeing a boom in jobs, and there is this anticipated kind of much bigger boom as some of the job training programs get underway. You know, there's some interesting stuff happening in the city of Boston that the Wu administration has implemented to really hit the intersection of job development and clean energy. And then on the fisheries thing, you know, that's a tough one. Like, I'm from Maine, coastal Maine. I grew up there. You know, we had our lobsters were delivered in a paint bucket that would get dropped at the end of our driveway from people that we knew who were lobster fishermen. Like, it is a part of your life. There are these incredible growing pains that are happening right now. That are hard. You know, the Boston Globe, not myself, colleagues of mine at the Boston Globe, I think did a really beautiful job of looking at some of those challenges in a series last year that they did. You know, that there is that reality. There is another reality too, though, around like the growth of aquaculture and a lot of like the kind of blue carbon movement to use the ocean in really creative ways that is, I think, bringing new industries to life, and especially in a place like New England, where we don't have a fossil fuel industry to lose, there is a lot to gain in the birth of those new industries.
Yeah. Can I add one thing to the fishing comment too? So about 2 years ago, Ben Storo of E&E, who's a good friend of all of ours, he and I did a series about offshore wind, and we did a big story about fishing. And our takeaway from that was that, yes, offshore wind is going to impact fishermen, but it will not impact fishermen in an equal way. It's going to as this feels like the story you hear over and over again, right? But it is going most likely to disproportionately impact small-time fishermen, the people who tend to fish near the shore, who don't have as much flexibility in where they go, who can't just, you know, get a bigger boat and go out here. But a lot of the big-time fishermen are probably gonna be okay. We're not gonna build wind farms in George's Bank. And so that's sad, and that's really, you know, it's coming on top of an industry that's already struggling for other economic reasons. And I think one thing that I come back to a lot in climate reporting, and I would imagine you guys do too, is that there is no perfect solution to anything. Everything involves trade-offs, and the stories are often in how we manage those trade-offs and how we help people find a new job, or, you know, how we manage those trade-offs, I guess is how I would summarize that.
Anything to add? So maybe staying on the jobs, we mentioned before that environmental justice is a big priority, as is a diverse workforce. I'm curious how you are seeing that playing out. How are training programs, MassCEC, we have folks in the audience here, how are they being intentional about making sure that these jobs and the training for those jobs goes to the people that need them the most?
I mean, there's a lot of outreach being done. What's interesting too, also, Ben and I in our series did one of the stories, obviously looked at jobs, right? And it's the union pipeline that you need to address. It's not necessarily the training program, which is interesting, right? You need to, and the unions, to their credit, I think some of them, probably better than others, are out there trying to get young people to come in and work in an apprenticeship program, because you can train an electrician to go up on a wind turbine, but you need an electrician first. And so I think that's an interesting thing.
There are some cool training programs that are being launched, though. Like, for instance, year-ish ago when Mayor Wu was announcing an effort to start electrifying school buses. She made the announcement at one of the local technical high schools, where they were also announcing the creation of a program to train EV electricians there, and it was like what they call it, a train the trainers program. So there was this entire kind of infrastructure built around teaching kids skills that would result in being employed in really, coveted positions, but also using it they were going to be repairing, working on some of the electric vehicles that the city has, and also the buses, right? And so it was a situation where you could have students who were riding some of the first electric school buses to their schools, where they were then learning to work on those engines, repairing the engines of other electric vehicles for the city of Boston that they were in the process of switching over to, and then leaving school, graduating, and getting a job as a mechanic working on electric vehicles, right? So it was like this very clear model for addressing a problem right now on the ground, and then building a nice future for these kids in the process.
And real quick, I think I would be remiss if I did not mention that a lot of local universities also have really amazing training programs. So Bristol University, the Mass Maritime Academy, they are going hard on training offshore wind workers and probably solar workers too. So there is momentum happening. I think,
We're in so many things, I feel like we were on the precipice
cusp, yeah.
of this thing just totally blowing up, right? And it definitely applies to the
but
jobs.
if you know a young person, you should probably tell them to go become an electrician. That's
Definitely.
still probably the right thing.
And this is also another area where, again, it's something that the project developers, the companies behind these big offshore wind projects spend a lot of time thinking about. They have people not only working on building the sort of active workforce of today, but working on long-term strategy. And, it's in their best interest to be building a really robust pipeline of workers, and one that's, strong and stable and with good paying jobs.
Absolutely. Another big area for the states is building decarbonization. Building decarbonization has been in the news a lot lately. If you missed it, Canary Media did a big series about this, which I recommend everyone go check out on the site. But more locally, the Healy administration has a goal of installing 1 million heat pumps by 2030, and decarbonizing 500,000 homes by 2030. In states that have very old buildings, that is a huge challenge. So how are states doing in building decarbonization? And who wants to take that first?
I can. Here's a quiz. Anybody know how many heat pumps were installed in Massachusetts last year through the Mass Save program? I'll just cut to the chase. No, not zero. No, there were a lot. It was
200,000. No, too ambitious.
Let's just take an order of magnitude.
20,000.
Boom, it's about 22,000, which was a 2.5 times increase over the year before. Okay, so it was a huge growth in the amount of heat pumps that were installed in the state of Massachusetts. It was a small fraction of what needs to be installed in the state of Massachusetts. So there are incredible programs that have been offered through this reform of the Mass Save Energy Efficiency Program. I wish I could qualify for it in Maine. I cannot. You can save a ton of money by installing heat pumps now. And then you add the IRA on top of that, the federal legislation from the Biden administration, and things start to become more affordable and within grasp for a larger number of people, right? That has not been the case until now. And so, again, let's talk about things that are on the cusp. We are on the cusp of this big growth, except you can't do it if you don't have the people who do the job, right? So you have to have all these pieces lined up together to actually be able to take advantage of it. In climate, we talk about the hockey stick a lot. Mostly we talk about it in terms of how global warming is going through the roof with fossil fuel emissions, but it also works for the growth of clean tech and the adoption, and this idea that you kind of limp along for a while until you hit these inflection points, and I think that we're at the cusp of one now.
Yeah, I haven't covered it as closely from a statewide perspective, but anecdotally in my personal life, I feel like I sense a shift. People will ask me about it. They know I cover energy, and I have to tell them I don't really know. Go ask somebody else. But the amount of people talking about, should I install heat pumps? Should I, move that way, and sort of, is it cost efficient? Just asking the question and looking around, I feel like has exploded in the last couple of years.
Absolutely. I think heat pumps are having a huge moment.
It's so hot right now.
Yeah. Which is awesome. But something else that's having a bit of a moment is building codes and gas bans. So as part of the law that passed last year, there is a pilot program that allows 10 municipalities within the state to enact gas bans for states that burn a lot of gas. How is that going? I know that was one of the sticking points for Governor Baker that almost derailed the entire bill. Where are we at now with that program? Who wants to start?
Do you want to do that?
Sure. So we are right now in the process of selecting the 10 cities that will get to participate. There is preference going to municipalities that had expressed an interest in this prior to the passing of the climate bill, and I think 7 of them still want to be, some number of that, some have dropped out. So there's room for others to apply. We know the city of Boston intends to apply, which would be huge. And, if you sort of look at the legislation, what they're hoping to do with this pilot program is get out some of the growing pains early on. And they want a diverse set of cities to participate. They don't just want a bunch of wealthy suburbs outside of Boston to do it. You want practice doing this in a big city like Boston. You want practice doing this in a more rural area. So it'll be very interesting to see what towns get selected. And I think that selection happens at the end of this year, early next year.
So the selection from the initial 10 that applied, that is going to be happening through the fall on a rolling basis. So
Okay.
My understanding is that, come like September, October, November, we might start hearing the first couple communities. After they've gone through those first 10, then they go back into the bucket to see, all right, of those other ones who have applied, who do we, who's going to get the spot? And those announcements will come, I think, in March of 2024. So,
Yeah, that
so
sounds
like
right.
the earliest you would know, for instance, that if Boston is selected, I think would be March of 2024, at least according to the statute.
I think what's so interesting to me about this program, which I've really enjoyed writing about and following, is that there are all these cities and towns in Massachusetts that have progressive leadership who really want to take action on climate, and this is an area where they have a lot of power and authority and control over generally, so it's an opportunity for them to sort of leverage that and to, within the borders of their town, to set this restriction and to measure it and to contribute to sort of what the state's working on. And I think it sort of empowers and energizes cities and towns in a way that they've been sort of really trying to, and they've been asking to for a while now.
Yeah, it's funny, like if you think about how long Brookline was trying to get going on this, it's like there was like this rubber band just like pulling back and pulling back and pulling back right now. All these other communities, as Brookline's being told, no, you can't do it, they're all kind of coming on, and then suddenly it's like ping, and you've got all these communities that want to be part of the ban, but that at the same time are adopting this specialized building code, which does not ban fossil fuels, but what it does is it makes it very unattractive to build with fossil fuels for new buildings. So you have all these additional things that you have to do. You have to pre-wire the building so that it can be fully electrified later. You have to add solar panels. You have to reach a certain higher building standard that costs more for a reason. And in doing that, the idea is to disincentivize fossil fuels without, falling short of an all-out ban. We saw the city of Boston just yesterday fully adopting that. And we've seen several cities around the state that have done the same, and others that have indicated that they are hoping to do it as well. So like between those two things, between the specialized building code and the ban, the amount of movement happening at this very moment, it's pretty kind of head spinning.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many people I've talked to that have gotten really down like a rabbit hole of climate, and you're like, also you got really into building codes too? Like, who knew? But one more thing on the pilot program that I think is interesting is, it was a compromise, and I think a lot of very climate conscious people were disappointed that was the outcome, because the year prior, you talk to the architects of the 2021 climate law, and they had intended to write into legislation the ability for towns to require all electric or ban fossil fuels. And that was not the way that the Baker administration interpreted that statute. So in the 2022 law, they sort of went back to course correct, and there was more sticking points. And yes, it almost did derail the climate law, and so the compromise was a pilot program. And while that will be slower in reducing emissions probably than allowing towns to do it, I do think there is a silver lining to that, which is that like we're going to collect a ton of data, because in order to be a participant in this, you need to be collecting data about electric bills, you need to be collecting data about building costs. Like we are really going to have some good data about what it means to go all electric. And hopefully that means that as that extends to more towns in the future, it becomes more affordable and we avoid certain pitfalls. So I do think it is, I mean, as far as I know, Massachusetts is the only state that has a pilot program. Other states have allowed bans outright, but I do think that's a really interesting thing to watch. Like, this is a place where we really desperately need more housing and we need more affordable housing. And so, you know, there were two good causes in tension, which is, are you going to make housing harder to build and more expensive, or are you going to help the climate? And those two things shouldn't have to be in tension. And so hopefully what will come from this pilot program is the knowledge we need to make sure that they're not going forward.
So let's talk about affordable housing for a moment, because there is a huge equity component when it comes to building decarbonization, both because of the health impacts of burning fossil fuels where we live, but also because while it has upfront costs, it also, electrifying buildings has the potential to save folks money in the long term. What is the state or other states in New England, what are they doing to make sure or aid in affordable housing being able to participate in these decarbonization strategies or lower income housing?
What is the state of Massachusetts doing?
Yeah.
I just talked a lot. If you want to take it, I can take it too.
I can start. I mean, I think there is what the state plans to do and what the state says it's going to do, and then there's like what the state is doing, and those are not the same thing. In the sense that I think there's still a really big donut hole. I think there are a lot of people who are being left out. You know, I think that there's a lot of great language and intention around reaching out into environmental justice communities and making sure they're able to access mass save rebates and be able to participate, especially because a lot of these mass save rebates are, you know, some of them are like 100% covered if you're low income, right? But if you're not offering that in the language and with contractors in the communities who speak the language, then you might as well offer nothing. And there are a lot of places where there still is this huge gap. And again, we've heard a lot of things about efforts to close that gap, but I have not heard much from folks on the ground about actually seeing that work being done. And so, you know, look, in addition to hiring a new climate chief, Maura Healey also created an environmental justice position and hired a very beloved environmental justice champion in Maria Belén Power to fill that role. So there's a lot of optimism around some of the work and the opportunity for change. She just started, so I'm not going to judge her on what has and hasn't happened yet. But so the hope is that will bring more people along, but that's a lot of pressure to put on one person, I would say.
Yeah, I think too, unless I've been talking a lot, so cut me off. But another problem when it comes to building decarbonization and affordability is that it is very different if you own your home and if you rent. If you own your home, you have many more incentives to decarbonize than a landlord does, right? If you are someone who owns a couple of triple deckers in East Boston or South Boston, you don't have any incentive to do this because people are paying you crazy rent anyways, and they're paying their own utility bills. So I'm very curious to see what this administration is going to do to try to bring landlords around, and whether that means you need some sort of like mandate to say that all buildings need to be X, Y, and Z by X, Y, and Z date. I think that people don't want to touch that, but there are those who say maybe that is what we need. I don't know, but yeah, there is sort of like a market mismatch there a little bit.
Well, an alternative to a mandate is to come up with incentives that are
Yes.
too good to pass up. offers they can't refuse.
Yep.
Yeah. And I mean, you've got stuff like Birdo 2.0 in Boston, right? That is addressing, it provides a model for addressing existing buildings by saying that this is a, that buildings must, buildings over a certain size must decarbonize or reduce their emissions by X amount at different increments over time, right? It puts them on a schedule to accomplish that. We haven't really heard proposals to do that for existing buildings. I think that there is this real fear of switching over to the stick mode of climate rule. Like we're all about the carrots right now. At a certain point, there is this, people will admit quietly that we will switch to sticks, but we're not there yet. At a certain point, we will be, and I think that you point out in particular is where one of the biggest sticks will have to be is for landlords, because right now there's
no incentive.
There's
yeah.
none. Yeah.
So speaking of stakes, where are the gas utilities in all of this? Or where else is there pushback to talk about building decarbonization or going further with potential bans for new construction, for example?
Well, the gas utilities certainly are not thrilled with the prospect of homes that are no longer hooked up to natural gas. But I think from some of the building sector folks, you see pushback too. I think some of it might just be this is something new, this is something scary, untested. Others, are very concerned about the affordability of building decarbonization. I think you see a variety of pushback, of types of pushback.
Yeah, and one thing that the utilities have sort of pivoted to is talking a lot about hydrogen. Their sort of main incentive is that they want to keep using the pipes and distribution systems that they've been developing for decades or however long. And so that's one thing that they sort of push for is can we, sort of use green hydrogen, renewable hydrogen, whatever you want to call it. We could debate those terms for like 3 hours if we wanted to, instead of sort of other options that would force them to sort of completely get off the pipe system that they already use. So that's sort of where they come from, and you understand, why they would have that financial sort of position.
Yeah, I think there's been this fundamental mismatch between the vision that gets laid out in state climate plans that leans really heavily on electrification, and then when you talk with the utilities and look at the plans that they're submitting to the Department of Public Utilities and their own internal plans, which clearly say, the message that's coming out is, look, we're a gas utility. We are also an electric utility, and we are absolutely on board with this energy transition. We believe that in order to do this in the best way, that transition looks like this. People have heat pumps and gas. And over time, that gas transitions from fossil methane gas to gas that is made from renewable gas and a blend of green hydrogen, without really looking at the same things that advocates will tell you is problematic about those things. Like there isn't very much of it, and it's super expensive, requires a lot of energy, it emits harmful toxins into your house, or will eat up your appliances. There are myriad reasons why they will say these things are really bad ideas, and yet it's like a foregone thing. Well, of course we're gonna have the pipes, we're gonna need them, because electrification is not sufficient to actually heat your home on a cold day in Massachusetts, which the facts don't agree with that. But I think, what we have seen and what all of us have reported on quite a bit is this kind of pushing, shoving between the advocates and between the state government and between the utilities that's playing out at the Department of Utilities through various proceedings to really say, what is this going to look like? How are we going to get where we need to go? Because there is not yet right now there is all this business incentive for the gas utilities to maintain their infrastructure and
to build new infrastructure.
And to build new infrastructure, because that's how they make money. But there's not a whole lot, it's like the state has just allowed that to be the way that this is. And so without really fundamentally rethinking the role that utilities play in the state, it's hard to see it going any other way, because right now we say, it's your job, tell us.
Yeah.
How does this work? What is the path forward?
Yeah, and going back to your idea of the stick, I mean, I've had that same thought, and I've wondered when does it transition from a sort of push and pull and a nudge and whatever to sort of a more sort of outright, conflict, because you certainly could see it heading that way as the utilities remain stubbornly pretty tied to their business model, and as more and more sort of progressive governments come in the state of Massachusetts and say we need to change.
Absolutely. That leaves us with our last big bucket to tackle, which is transportation. Transportation emissions make up the largest amount of emissions in the state, and there's a ton to do on that front as well, both incentivizing EVs for private folks to drive, but also the MBTA and electrifying public transport. So where are we at when it comes to transportation electrification?
Well, the MBTA is going great, so I don't think you have anything to worry about there. Sorry, I couldn't help myself.
No notes. Do you want to go?
No, go for it. Go for it.
I'm talking too much. Someone else.
I mean, we're behind. Like we can, we can
It's
say
not
that.
going great. Yeah, I mean, look, I wish I could remember numbers off the top of my head better than I can, because we pulled all these numbers to look at what kind of EV registrations do we have compared to what the goals are. Suffice it to say, it's not good. Again, similar to heat pumps, there is this hope that we are in this moment of change. We've got bigger state rebates. We've got rebates for used vehicles for the first time ever. We've got enhanced rebates for, did that end up happening?
It's
for
coming.
It's coming.
It will be announced
Right,
sometime
okay.
this month.
It is,
apparently.
okay. So this amorphous additional rebate that will happen eventually for lower income folks, and then we've got the federal incentives. And we've got all these new models that allegedly someday the supply chain will figure itself out, so these models will actually be able to be purchased instead of just sitting on a waiting list for 2 to 5 years or however long it is these days. So there is this moment. We are not yet in it. We are like creeping up to it.
I'd say the
slowly.
same goes with the charging infrastructure, where
Yes.
it's so close, and I really think if we were having, I agree completely with what you said, and if we were having this conversation in 3 years, I think the EV landscape would be very, very different. That said, I think EVs are still out of reach, even used EVs, for a lot of people, and so that is going to be something that will need to be tackled. Also, the solution can't be that everyone has an EV.
Yeah.
I don't know how many of you drove here, but traffic is horrible. The last thing we want is more cars on the road, but also just from an equity standpoint and from a practicality standpoint, we need to invest in alternative modes of transportation. And I think the Healy administration is committed to doing that, and we'll see what the new GM of the T brings to that. But it's hard to have a city, and it's hard to talk about decarbonizing the transportation sector when you have a public transportation system that is very limited and barely works when you need it to.
It is noteworthy though, how little we talk about mode switching.
Yeah.
It's just
No one wants to talk about it.
Nobody wants to talk about it. And I have talked with government folks who are yeah, we're psyched. We are really beefing up the chat about mode switching. And then you look at the thing that they're referring to, and it's there's 2 sentences, and whereas before I guess there were none, but there's so when you look at where there are really big gaps that have to get made up, introducing and normalizing that concept that it can't be 1-to-1 car gas car to EV. I think it's a big one.
Well, not to be pessimistic about it, but even the T's process of electrification has been really messy. The commuter rail electrification is something I've written about. There's been all these debates about what technology you use. Do you use the catenary wires? Do you use electric locomotives? There's they don't have enough money for it, so they're waiting on the legislature, and it's just nothing is easy on that front, but it's obviously vitally important.
Yeah, they're still buying some diesel hybrid buses that will run in EJ neighborhoods. There's a lot.
So I have some numbers to bring into this.
okay.
Great.
The MBTA is supposed to stop purchasing fossil fuel buses at the end of 2030. Does anyone want to take a guess at how many battery electric buses the T had as of last year?
As of last year. Was it in the single or the double digits?
Single.
Oh, no.
5. 5 battery electric buses. So, I mean, that's a long way to go, not to mention the charging infrastructure for these massive amount of public buses. On the EV front, the state says we need 200,000 electric vehicles by 2025. How many do we have right now?
I literally wrote this story.
You did write the
100,000
story. We have 51,000
I'm way off.
EVs. And the public charging stations are a huge issue too, right? We don't have enough, and the ones that we do have are concentrated, unsurprisingly, in wealthier parts of the city. And so that equity component is also going to have to be really important in how those are distributed to make them accessible. But I think that does bring up a conflict. I think the little laugh we got out of the room is because we know how hard it is to get around already. I'm on the Silver Line and I'm waiting 15 to 25 minutes for, like, if I miss the bus, right? So that's already like you are very late. So how do you see that balance playing out of like these very ambitious goals, while at the same time we need reliability of public transportation so that people don't then go back to driving cars or taking Ubers or other things?
I mean, it's sad to say, but it really is hard to think about the decarbonization of the public transit system right now. Like, it's really not even serving its basic function. So I don't know how you can even, there are people at the T who are trying, and they should be trying to have those conversations, but I'm not even sure how you bring that to the fore at the moment, honestly.
I mean, some of it I think comes down to like redesigning streets too. Like, I could ride my bike to WBUR, but like it scares me, and so I don't, right? But I could, and I think that you know, kudos to all you bikers and on Com Ave and everyone there. But you know, there are ways also to do mode shifting that are less like you must get rid of your EV and start riding a bike, but just making it more acceptable and making it safer.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it is, I mean, I think we are at the point now where I think it is a valid question to ask. Is the T going to be one of the things that stands in the way of Massachusetts reaching its climate goals? Because how are you, if you rely on the MBTA, how are you supposed to trust that when you're making decisions about how you're going to get around? You know,
And I think some of it too, your colleague Taylor did a fantastic story that I would totally encourage everyone to go read about the delays in electrifying the MBTA. And one of the issues that she talked about was just overall supply chain issues, that even with the best of intentions, you can't get the things that you need to actually build the charging stations, and you can't get the battery buses that you need. So I mean, that's obviously not a Massachusetts specific problem, but there are bigger forces at play as well.
I was going to go back to EVs for just a second, because I do think that charging infrastructure is a bottleneck that people don't necessarily give as much credit to as they should. It's sort of, it goes a little bit under the radar, and I think that there are buckets and buckets of federal money coming in to every state in the country for charging infrastructure. Some states are going to do well to use that money to build out an equitable and effective network, and others aren't. So we'll have to see if Massachusetts is one of those.
Yeah.
So being mindful of time and that we don't want to end on this bleak note, before we open it up to questions, I would love to hear from each of you. What is a story, a policy, or a local initiative that you are super excited about that you are currently following or want to follow more closely? Sam?
Can I have a second to think and see if one of them has something
Yeah,
ready?
I know, I do too. I mean, we mostly, like, I feel like I mostly spend my time in, like, the depressing space, so it's, like, a little hard. Like, if you want to tell me, like, what's bummed me out today, I could, like, list several things. So, optimism. Less familiar face. I think that there's interesting efforts that I've been seeing recently around designing school curriculums to integrate climate in a bigger way. You know, I think, not to be a downer, that falls against the backdrop of horrific things that are happening in public schools in more conservative states, right? And this incredible conservative backlash to the things that children are allowed to read. However, in a place like Massachusetts, in New England, I think there is some, like, inspiring work done to kind of bring climate change into everyone's lives at an earlier age and kind of get everyone involved.
All right, I'm going to take a cop out by really pandering to the home crowd here and say that the innovation, climate and energy innovation in Boston and Massachusetts and New England is really incredible. I've had a chance to tour Greentown a couple times and meet some of the companies who are working here and all over the region, and it's like we are a hotbed of that kind of stuff, and it shows, and people are moving here to work on those kind of things. You know, we're really central to it, and I think it's something the Healy administration is very aware of and looking to capitalize on, and people bring it up all the time, and I haven't really covered climate tech as closely, but it's hard to avoid when you're in Boston. So
I'll stick with the optimism too. I am very interested to see what happens with this little body that nobody knows about that is incredibly important called the Energy Facilities Siting Board. So this is the state body that essentially approves all big projects, and they have a tremendous amount of power, but it is not a particularly transparent organization, and it does not really allow for much public participation. And that has come to a head several times in several projects over the last few years. And I think that you see, you have had advocates calling for EFSB reform for years, and I think that the Healy administration is listening. And so I will be very curious to see, I know there's a few different iterations of it in legislation right now, so very curious to see what comes out of that. But I think that, I do believe that the siting board will become more people-focused, and that it will be required to pay more attention to the climate implications of the decisions it makes as well.
I would also add, that reminded me of something that's pretty cool that just happened, which is for many years, the Cape Light Compact, which provides electricity to parts of the Cape, has been trying to put forward this really progressive program and get it approved by the DPU, which would take some low and mid-income households and fully kind of take them off the grid, do a lot of weatherization, fully electrify them, provide them with solar panels, and it has a lot of benefits both to these individuals and also to the grid, right? It took years. The DPU found like 500 different ways to say this is not allowed under our rules, sorry, except that's now changed. And thanks in part to the legislation that passed last year, that was just recently approved. And so now that program is going to be able to take off, and I think it's a really interesting kind of case study in equity, in like how can we provide like wraparound electrification services to specific targeted households to try to kind of address this in a really holistic way. And I think it's really exciting to see what that's going to look like.
Awesome. Thank you for indulging my last question. That was great. We'd love to take some questions. I think we have a little bit of time from the audience.
Okay. So you talk about where there's hope, because offshore wind is rising in price and there are all kinds of roadblocks to siting wind and solar. How do we pay for it all? I would like to give you some hope and ask you to do some stories on nuclear power and all the advantages that get overlooked, and to change the public's opinion of that. So what would you all think of that?
nuclear power in New England is a really interesting subject. I think do we have one nuclear plant left? Two, okay. Yeah, I mean, the economics are just not very healthy for the companies who are running those plants. It's a really challenging space for them. I mean, nuclear has certainly been valuable to the grid. It will continue to be valuable to the grid. I just think that, it's a technology question, and there's been all this promise about small modular reactors or various other types of new nuclear technology that has been supposed to be sort of on the cusp for 10, 20 years at this point. Maybe we're actually there. The 10-year out joke, I think, is we're always 10 years out. But yeah, I mean, I think innovation could help with that. From a political and policy standpoint, there are certainly coalitions that want to keep nuclear alive and continue to have nuclear as an important part of the grid, but I don't really see us building a full-size, nuclear plant in New England potentially ever again.
Yeah, from my perspective, I think that there's sort of, like when you're thinking about nuclear, there's kind of two conversations happening. There's one which is, what should we do about the plants that exist right now? And I think the general consensus among climate folks seems to be keep the ones that are online as long as you can safely, because they provide quite a bit of power. And then there's the question about new nuclear plants. And I think Sam is right. The economics of like another big Pilgrim or another big like Vermont Yankee, like that's not going to happen. But yes, there is promise in the small modular. It just, again, right, the joke is like it's 10 years away. I think also there's a perception problem. And you can look no further than what's happening right now over the debate at Pilgrim with the radioactive wastewater. Nuclear scares people, and I think that that is something that you need to consider whenever you're thinking about that as a potential solution too.
Do we have any other questions?
Thank you. So I think Massachusetts has some of the highest electricity rates in the nation. And with the electrification push that you've been talking about, we're just going to add a whole lot more demand. At what point does this not, like prices are going to go up, presumably, if there is more demand? Maybe you could talk about like where you see prices going, and is there ever a future where in Massachusetts we have prices that are more in line with all the other states?
Yeah, I mean, in general, prices are really high this winter in particular, let's say, because the price of natural gas is really high. And that still to this day is more than 50% of our electricity in New England. And so one of the promises of renewable energy, and I am not an economist, so I will defer to what people are telling me on this, is that these, as people will say, the cost of wind and solar don't fluctuate with what Vladimir Putin does today, right? These are inherently less volatile commodities, and the idea is that in theory they should bring price stability.
But you asked like when.
Yeah, when.
There are these benchmarks that we're kind of on the precipice of, Vineyard Wind, for instance, being fully operational next year, 2028 for if the other two big offshore wind projects are able to happen. I think it's 2025 that the main transmission line, if it comes through. Each one of these moments is a very big moment in terms of switching over a large amount of the power so that there is less reliance on natural gas. And yeah, every minute that happens is one that, saves you money.
This also gives me another chance to talk about a point of optimism, so we can go there. But there's an increasing trend among utilities and state regulators about looking at creative rate design. And what that means is sort of changing the way that customers are charged for electricity. So one great example, which probably many of you have heard about, is time of use rates. That's essentially charging a different amount depending on when you're using electricity. It's often referred to sort of with EV charging. So for example, you're charging your car at night when fewer people are using electricity, and you might get a discount for that. And there's other rate design ideas as well, variable rates versus sort of straight rates is one way to put it. And so I think, the point is that with the technology that you're talking about that's leading to electrification, there's also a lot of new opportunities for demand response and for systems that are more responsive and more flexible to allow prices to come down.
And I think maybe we have time for one last question. Where is...
Hi, Alistair Pym from NECEC, the North East Clean Energy Council. You talked about nuclear, but there's another type of nuclear, there's fusion. What do you think of fusion as a solution for the future?
Oh wait, that's the one that's 10 years off, not regular.
Right, that was, I read that one article that came out recently about the breakthrough. I didn't understand much of the science. I enjoyed the debate on Twitter and elsewhere around it, and that's frankly the extent of my knowledge about fusion. It's, because it's not sort of used in any real way, and it's hard for us to find time to focus on, honestly, for me at least as a reporter.
I think it's really friggin' cool. I mean, right? Like, super exciting. It feels a little bit like space aged, and I've also heard arguments that say like we need to throw everything we've got at all sorts of promising technology like nuclear fusion, but also not get distracted by shiny things, because we have a lot of technology that we know works. And so doubling, tripling, quadrupling down on that, while also allowing this research to go on and investment to go on in that corner too, is really the way that we can ensure that we've got like ample coverage, because there's no moment where 30 years from now we'll have nuclear fusion and we'll be like, God, I wish we didn't have so much offshore wind. Like, that's the worst, you know? Like, there's nothing wrong with doing that. There's no bad side. So, I mean, hopefully, you know, the cool shiny thing pans out and we're good to go.
Yeah, ditto to both of those comments.
Yeah, I would just encourage you to go out to Fort Devens, where there's going to be something happening in the next 5 years. It's not 10 years away, so check it out.
All right.
Cool. Well, thank you so much. I am a reader, a listener, and honestly a huge fan of the three of you. So thank you for being here with us today. And thank you all for coming out and sticking around. But yeah.
Thank you.